10 worst things to come out of the US. Number 10. For-profit prisons. The United States right now has around 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population, at 2.3 million people. That's despite the fact that crime rates have been declining for decades. While not the only one, a major reason for that is private prisons. They originated in an early form from the American Revolution, but private prisons as we know them began with the Corrections Corporation of America in 1984. To save taxpayer costs, 8% of inmates were held in private prisons in 2015. The businesses running them increased their profit margins by taking government stipends, then cutting back on staff, serving substandard food, and courting investors based on the high recidivism of inmates. The end result is increased incarceration, higher levels of inmate abuse, and a lack of rehabilitation for prisoners, since reoffending is in the best interests of the companies who profit from locking them up. Number 9. Syphilis. It's well known that when European settlers first travelled to the New World in 1492, they brought over a range of deadly diseases, like smallpox and measles, causing widespread deaths. But they didn't just send over diseases. The evidence suggests they brought one back too, and a pretty bad one at that. Just 3 years after Christopher Columbus's voyage, the first verifiable case of syphilis began showing up in Europe, complete with large boils and a foul odour. Over the next 400 years, syphilis established itself as a truly widespread epidemic, only being tackled with the invention of penicillin in the 20th century. But thanks to the nature of syphilis, there is some debate about how sure we can be of this narrative. Conflicting studies have pointed to evidence like a skeleton from Croatia, with a deformation resembling its effects. But while the Croatian syphilis link remains unproven, Columbus and therefore America is the best theory we have. Number 8. Corporate lobbying. Lobbying is nothing new in politics. Since as early as the 1640s, British special interest groups were known to petition MPs in Parliament. But the US is known for setting the standard on bigger, bolder, and much less popular corporate lobbying, to the point where it's seen as the least ethical job in the country at just 6% approval. It's mostly down to the perception that lobbying subverts democracy by putting political influence in the deepest pockets. Now that's a fair assessment, since American groups spend $2.4 billion per year lobbying. That's more than the cost of running both the Senate and the Congress, and 72 times British lobbying expenditure, not to mention that 34 times more of that money is spent by corporations than public interest groups. The most common lobbying cause is soliciting individual tax exemptions, but often lobbyists pressure politicians to oppose laws that support the public over business interests, whether it's over environmental regulation, public safety, or, well, just follow the money. Number 7. Shale fracking. Global energy consumption has increased by around 50% between 1991 and now. So in order to meet those needs, we've been employing more aggressive means of extracting fuel from the earth. Shale fracking is the highly controversial method of pumping high-pressure fluid into underground shale rocks to fracture them and release natural gas. It began in Kentucky in 1965 and has recently caused major political debate. On a direct level, fracking wells have been found to cause serious health problems. For example, residents in the town of Ponder in Texas have reported nausea, nosebleeds, and chemicals seeping into their drinking water as a direct result. And a study on Pennsylvania fracking sites found a 40% increase in premature births and a 30% increase in high-risk pregnancies. Admittedly, fracking is highly profitable for the US, but studies suggest renewable energies are being underfunded as a result, despite being a better long-term investment. Number 6. Tetraethyl lead. Petrol cars aren't particularly green, even most modern ones. In fact, cars contribute to around 15% of all carbon emissions, but it could be worse. Until the end of the 20th century, some petrol was highly poisonous too. In the 1920s, American engineer Thomas Midgley invented tetraethyl lead, a petrol additive that prevented engine knocking. Midgley claimed that the substance was safe enough to wash your hands with, even though he'd just spent weeks recovering from lead poisoning after working with it. But from then until the mid-1990s, Midgley's invention was found to pump massive amounts of lead into the environment, increasing levels in children, and some scientists even suggest causal links to a decades-long increase in crime. It was even known to have harmful mental effects at the time, since the factories producing it were known as loony gas buildings on account of their employees' erratic behaviour. Number 5. Americanization. Now, this term refers to the cultural influence and homogenization that the US exerts over other countries, whether it's Starbucks in a third of countries, the ubiquity of American TV, or the prevalence of Americanisms in the English language. Now, I know what you're thinking. It sounds like a bit of a cheap shot to say that American culture influence is one of the worst things to come out of the US, since the phenomenon isn't inherently bad. However, it has arguably caused a lot of problems. For example, frustrations with American cultural expansion are often exploited by terrorist recruiters. But the biggest issue right now comes from the global dominance of US tech companies like Google and Facebook. Those two sites are the most popular in every country save Russia, China, and a few others, which gives the US tech sector a massive influence over international law and causes major concern in governments over privacy of its citizens. Number 4. Fast food. Accounts differ on when fast food actually first came about, whether it was the automat food dispenser in 1902, the first White Castle restaurant in 1921, or the first McDonald's in 1954. But whatever the case, one of America's most famous cultural exports has caused massive health problems, tasty as it is. Countless studies have pointed to a link between fast food and obesity in countries all the way from the US to China. As many as a third of children are overweight in some countries, and 3.5 million worldwide now have type 2 diabetes, largely due to fast food, which would have been unheard of a few decades ago. At its very worst, fast food and processed food have been blamed for the incredible 90% obesity rate in the Pacific island of Nauru, whose poor soil makes it necessary to rely on. Number 3. CFCs. Early refrigerators were a marvel in food storage, but they tended to leak toxic gases like ammonia and sulfur dioxide. In one case in Ohio in 1929, a hospital fridge leak killed more than 100 people. So just 3 days after that tragedy, our old American friend Thomas Midgley Jr. invented a new refrigeration gas in the form of this chemical right here. Going by the trade name Freon, this non-toxic and non-flammable substance was used around the world for decades in everything from fridges to aerosols. What they didn't know then was that when CFCs leak into the stratosphere, the reaction causes serious damage to the ozone, increasing the amount of UV rays that reach the Earth. They were banned in the US in 1978, but after decades of decline, the CFC levels in the atmosphere have spiked recently. And most troublingly, we have no idea where or who it's coming from. Number 2. Agent Orange. It's not a stretch to say that Vietnam wasn't the best time for America, whether it was the arguably false pretenses, the widespread protests, or the profound military failure. But one of the most heinous things to come out of America's actions in Vietnam is the use of herbicides known as Agent Orange. As part of Operation Ranch Hand, the US Air Force would spray a mixture of 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D herbicides onto vegetation to destroy leaves and expose hidden guerrilla fighters. But the use of herbicide warfare has had a major impact on the population of Vietnam. It's estimated that 4.5 million people were exposed to Agent Orange and 3 million of them affected by it. Those effects include neuropathy, leukemia, Hodgkin's disease, spina bifida and Parkinson's disease. Even to this day, children are born with deformities and birth defects as a result of Agent Orange. Number 1. Nuclear weapons. It shouldn't really be a surprise that the most destructive weapon in history, which just so happens to have been made in the US, makes it onto this list. Developed by Robert Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project between 1942 and 1946, nuclear weapons work by splitting the nucleus of fissile atoms and releasing kilotons worth of energy. And in the only 2 military uses of nuclear weapons in history, perpetrated by the US in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 226,000 people died in total. Since then, nuclear weapons led to the idea of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, where the act of using them will inevitably lead to either the target or their allies using theirs against you. MAD and the associated paranoia hasn't really gone away over time. You only need to look at Iran or particularly North Korea to see that modern nuclear fears are very real, and that aggressive regimes see MAD as the key to safety. That was the 10 worst things to come out of the US. Did we miss anything? And do you think that America gets an unfair rep? Let us know in the comments and make sure to like and subscribe. And while you're at it, check out this great All Time 10s video on screen now.